Before Venezuela collapsed on television screens, it collapsed on spreadsheets, not in riots, not in sanctions, not in hyperinflation headlines. The disaster people remember, empty shelves, collapsing currency, millions fleeing, was only the visible phase of something that had already failed internally. By the time the world noticed Venezuela was starving, the outcome was already locked in. This wasn't a poor country trapped by bad luck. This was a rich country trapped by its own design. Venezuela wasn't supposed to fail. It had what developing nations spend decades chasing: more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, some of the cheapest extraction costs on Earth. A state oil company that, at its peak, generated tens of billions of dollars every year. On paper, Venezuela didn't need reform. It needed discipline. But oil doesn't reward discipline. It rewards dependence. And slowly, almost invisibly, Venezuela stopped building an economy and started spending one. Nothing collapsed yet. Nothing looked broken. The system was still running. Money was still flowing. Imports were still arriving. But beneath the surface, something crucial had disappeared. Production. Oil didn't just fund Venezuela, it replaced Venezuela. Why grow food when oil could import it cheaper? Why build factories when oil covered deficits instantly? Why tax citizens when oil paid the state directly? Every hard economic decision became optional. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture shrank. Private industry lost relevance. Not because Venezuela couldn't produce, but because producing no longer mattered. Oil revenues flooded the system, and the currency strengthened artificially. Imports became cheaper than domestic goods. Local producers couldn't compete. This wasn't corruption yet. This was structure. By the early 2000s, oil made up over 90% of export earnings. Almost all foreign currency came from one source. The state became the primary economic actor. Venezuela didn't diversify slowly. It undiversified rapidly. The economy didn't collapse. It hollowed out. As long as oil prices stayed high, the math worked. As long as dollars kept flowing, nothing looked urgent. But the country was no longer producing value. It was consuming revenue, and revenue is not an economy. It's a temporary condition. Oil stopped being an economic input. It became a political instrument. Control the oil company and you controlled the country. PDVSA was no longer treated as an industrial asset that needed efficiency, reinvestment, and technical competence. It was treated as a cash machine. Revenues were redirected directly into social spending. Budgets were bypassed. Oil money financed loyalty, not capacity. Engineers were replaced by loyalists. Maintenance budgets were cut. Long-term investment was postponed. Because oil prices made postponement feel safe. This wasn't mismanagement by accident. It was mismanagement by design. Oil revenue insulated the state from its citizens. No taxation meant no accountability. No productivity meant no pressure. Politics replaced economics because economics no longer constrained politics. As long as oil paid the bills, every structural weakness could be ignored. But oil fields don't run on speeches. Refineries don't run on ideology. And production doesn't forgive neglect. By the time output started slipping, the system had already lost its technical backbone. Venezuela was still an oil country. It was just no longer an oil producer in the way it needed to be. The collapse didn't begin with panic. It began with arithmetic. Oil prices fell. Revenues dropped sharply. But spending didn't adjust. The government had built obligations assuming oil would always cover the gap. When it didn't, the response wasn't reform. It was money creation. Currency controls trapped dollars inside the system. Imports slowed. Shortages appeared quietly at first. To fill the hole, the state printed bolivars at accelerating speed. This wasn't reckless ignorance. It was the only option left inside a system that had eliminated production. More money chased fewer goods, prices detached from reality. The currency stopped functioning as a store of value. Hyperinflation wasn't chaos, it was a mathematical outcome. Once oil could no longer subsidize the economy had nothing underneath it. The system didn't snap, it unraveled, and there was no switch to turn it back on. At some point, the believer stopped being currency. It still existed, it was still printed, it was still counted. But it no longer represented value. Prices didn't rise gradually, they disconnected. A salary earned in the morning was worthless by evening. Savings became a liability. The state printed faster to survive another week. Businesses raised prices to survive another day. Citizens spent immediately, not because they wanted to, but because delay meant loss. Cash flooded the economy while goods disappeared. Not because of hoarding, not because of sabotage, because production had already collapsed. Venezuela wasn't experiencing inflation inside an economy. It was experiencing inflation instead of one. Food subsidies became meaningless without food. Price controls emptied shelves instead of lowering costs. Black markets replaced official ones because reality always finds an outlet. This wasn't collapse by explosion. It was collapse by erosion. Oil once paid for everything. Now it paid for almost nothing. Imports collapsed without dollars. Domestic agriculture couldn't recover fast enough. Logistics failed. Electricity failed. A country that exported energy couldn't stabilize its grid. A country with refineries couldn't refine enough fuel. A country with food subsidies couldn't keep supermarkets stocked. People didn't leave Venezuela because they lost hope. They left because the system stopped functioning. Hospitals without power, factories without inputs, cities without reliable transport. Oil wealth didn't protect society from collapse. It accelerated it. Because when everything depends on one resource, failure doesn't stay isolated. It spreads. And Venezuela had built no insulation. Venezuela didn't collapse because it ran out of oil. It collapsed because oil had already replaced everything else. When production vanished, there was nothing to restart. When imports stopped, there was nothing domestic to fall back on. When the currency failed, there was no confidence left to rebuild it. Oil wealth had removed friction from every bad decision. It delayed consequences long enough to make them irreversible. This is the part most explanations miss. Venezuela didn't fail gradually. It crossed a threshold. Once the state became the sole allocator of resources, once politics replaced markets, once production became optional, collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a timing issue. Oil didn't corrupt the system. It made the system fragile. And fragile systems don't bend. They break. Venezuela is not an anomaly. It's an unfiltered case study. Resource wealth doesn't destroy countries. Dependence does. When revenue replaces productivity and distribution replaces production, wealth stops being an asset. It becomes leverage, then a weapon, then a liability. Venezuela didn't lack talent. It didn't lack resources. It didn't lack opportunity. It lacked constraint. And without constraint, systems don't correct themselves. They amplify their own weaknesses until there's nothing left to amplify. This is what happens when an economy is built to spend wealth instead of create it. Not a crash, not a mistake, a design flaw finally exposed.